If you will open your Bibles to the book of James, we need to look at the last of James chapter 4 today. And we have come to a piece of James's writing in which James has talked to us about how God uses struggles in our lives, trials, hard times to grow us and mature us. James has talked to us about the tongue and the abuse of the tongue and the benefit of the tongue. He's talked to us about gossip and rumors. He's talked to us about wars and how they begin within us and how we want what we want, the selfishness of our lives. And all of this has been about James teaching us that we need to grow up. He's trying to help us to mature as God's children. And he comes to the end of the 4th chapter, and he speaks to us about the way that we think and how we do not always think truthfully, how we create scenarios in our minds and we run with them as if they are the gospel truth. And they're really just visions that we've made up of how we would like for things to be. And once again, we're back to selfishness. And he's wanting us to grow out of that. And so he takes just a handful of verses 13 through 17 of chapter 4, and he talks to us about knowing the truth. And once we know the truth, if we will respond to it in a correct way, if we will not deny it, then James says that we can take a major step forward in our Christian life. We can avoid some of the many mistakes that we've made. I think we need to begin this 4th chapter by simply reading verses 13 through 17. And it goes like this. It says, "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city. We will spend a year there. We will buy and we will sell and we will make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then it vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or do that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin." James has given us a lot to think about when it comes to our lives. He begins with the first verses 13 and 14, and he addresses the issue of knowing yourself. It's been stated by psychologists that we lie to ourselves to make ourselves feel good about the life that we're living. We tell ourselves, I'm right, and everybody else is wrong. We tell ourselves that I know better than the people around me. Now realize these are not statements that we voice out loud, or we would be back to the beginning of the chapter talking about fightings. But in our minds, we tell ourselves that I'm smarter than my spouse, my children, my parents, whomever we are around. And we are actually lying to ourselves, trying to make ourselves better, or at least to feel better, or to justify our actions. Now, realizing that comes from psychologists, so you can take that for what it's worth. So we're going to take what James says that God says about us, and we can take it all the way to the bank. But he begins by saying, knowing yourself. And this is how he explains it to us. I think it's interesting that James uses this phrase, "Come now, you who say." When we read that, we realize that it is the attitude that somebody uses with us when we've told them something and we kind of take a step back and say, "Come on now." And what do we mean by that? We mean, "I really don't believe what you just said. Come on now. You really mean that you drove from here to Atlanta in an hour and 15 minutes? Now, come on now." I mean, that's the type of attitude we use. But that's what James is saying to his church. And they've made plans, and they are talking about what they're going to do, and they're talking about what they're going to have in 10 years. And James stands and looks them in the eye, and he says, "Come on now. Do you really expect me to believe that?" Now, that kind of gets in our face when people treat us that way, doesn't it? Well, we need to understand that it's God saying it to our lives right now. Maybe this is a good point in our lives, this season of the year, this 2014, for us to open up our ears and allow God to say to us, call us by name, and say, "Come on now, let me hear it one more time about this life that you claim that you're living, and how great it is, and how everything is going your way. Let me hear it one more time. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city. Man, we're going to go into business. We're going to spend a year there. We're going to buy. We're going to sell. We're going to make a profit. We're going to retire at the age of 45, and then we're going to spend the rest of our life on the coast or in the mountains doing what we want to do." He says, "Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It's even a vapor." Do any of y'all know what's going to happen tomorrow? You know, there are people that tell me that they can tell you that. You can dial 1-900 psychic hotline and tell them your name and your credit card number, and they'll tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, that's got to be true, but they advertise that. And they couldn't have false advertising, could they? I'm reminded of the old preacher over in England who was confronted on the street by a gypsy. And she said to him, "If you will put some silver in my hand, I'll tell you the future." And he said, "Well, let me get this straight. You're telling me that if I pay you, if I give you some money, you can tell me what's going to happen in my life tomorrow." And she said, "That's right. I have that ability." He said, "That's amazing." He said, "I'll go one better than that." He said, "I will double whatever you're asking if you can tell me what happened to me yesterday." She said, "I think I have someplace else to go." You see, the idea of telling the future has been with us for centuries upon centuries. And people have proclaimed that they can tell us what's going to happen tomorrow. I wish I could recall the famous lady's name who claimed to predict John F. Kennedy's assassination. And we know her for that, if I could recall her name, so undoubtedly it didn't sink in too deeply. But what I'm reminded of is how many other predictions she made that never came true at all. So, you know, what is the old adage? Even a blind hog can find an acorn sometimes if it roots long enough. So if you talk enough, you can eventually say something that will happen tomorrow or next week. But James is telling us that we just do not have that ability. And he says you need to know yourself. You need to know that you cannot predict tomorrow. If you could, you would be extremely wealthy because you would be playing the stock market, or you would be buying and selling real estate. You'd be doing something. You wouldn't be sitting here this morning. But the truth about yourself and about me is this: you cannot predict tomorrow. And since we cannot predict what tomorrow is going to bring, James proclaims to us that we need to ask somebody who does know. Now, the Bible is filled with people just like you and me who did not know themselves fully, who were not truthful with themselves, and thought that they could predict the future. One of our famous cases is a man by the name of Joshua who talked to God, and God told him how to take the city of Jericho. And he stepped back and said, that worked pretty well. I sent some spies in. They spied the place out. They came back and said that they were afraid. God told me to march around the city. We didn't even have to raise a sword. We blew some horns and the walls fell. I'll send some spies to Ai, let them tell me what's going on. And they did that. They came back, said it's a little old bitty place. Don't waste your time walking up the hill. Send a few men. And what they received was a disaster. And Joshua falls on his face before God and cries out, "Oh God, what have you done?" And God simply says, "You didn't ask me. You didn't ask me. You thought that you knew the future, Joshua, but you didn't ask me what the future held." We could walk through the Bible and see that event occur time and time and time again, and I guarantee you we could walk through your life and my life and see the very same thing happen over and over again. When the whole time God tells us, if you will simply come and ask of me. Jesus was our prime example. He asked the Father, he prayed before all of his major decisions, before he chose the 12 disciples, before he announced that he was going to the cross, before he did many of the mighty miracles that he did. We have, especially in Luke's gospel, you go back and it says that he went alone and he prayed. He went alone and he prayed. He went alone and he prayed. And he asked the Father, "What is your will?" Just as James tells us right here. James could very well have learned this lesson living in the house with Jesus, seeing that Jesus went and talked to the Father about everyday decisions, even in a carpenter shop, because he did not know the future, but he knew the one who does know the future. You and I have the same opportunity today. James is not criticizing these people for making plans. He is correcting them for making plans without asking God. And you and I sit here guilty as charged because every one of us have done the same thing. We've made plans without first asking God, "What would you have me to do? What would you have me to do?" Well, I just want to know God's will. Well, that starts by doing whatever He's told you to do at this moment. Well, He's just told me to call my neighbor and ask them how they're feeling. Then do that first. And when you've been obedient there, He'll tell you what to do next. But God is telling us it is of necessity in our lives that we ask Him before we act. I'm going to ask you to think for just a moment right quick. The greatest failure in your life. Did you talk to God about the situation before you went out and tried what you failed at? Did you talk with God at all about it? And if you did, what did He say? Now let's look at our second point here. The second thing that James says to us is not only do we need to know ourselves, we need to be truthful with ourselves, folks. Please, learn to tell yourself the truth. Second, though, we need to know our future. We need to know what tomorrow holds. We're facing death. Me and you need to know what tomorrow holds. Look what he says to us in verses 14 through 16. He says, "You do not know what will happen tomorrow." None of us do. He says, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time, and then it vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this, or we do that. Now, if you've been reading in the book of Daniel lately, you'll know that at the very first chapter, we get in first and second chapter, we get into the great story of Nebuchadnezzar having a dream. And he is so frustrated with all of his wise men that he calls them together and he says, I've had a troubling dream. I've been up all night long. And they say, oh, king, just tell us your dream and we'll give you the interpretation. And he says, no. If you're really astrologers, if you're really wise men, if you're really magicians, if you really can read the future, he says, then I want you to tell me my dream and the interpretation. And they say, there's nobody that can do that. Nobody. Now, if you tell us the dream, we can tell you what it means, but we can't tell you the dream and the meaning. And he says, then off with your heads. And Daniel gets the knock on the door, and the captain of the king's guard says, I've been sent to take your head off. And Daniel says, why? And he tells him, and he says, give me a moment. Can you give me a moment with the king? And he says, sure. And he says, king, if you'll give me tonight, tomorrow morning I'll tell you this dream. He goes and brings his three closest friends together, and they pray all night, and they ask God to reveal the future to them. And God shows Daniel in a vision exactly what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed and exactly what the meaning was. And Daniel stands before Nebuchadnezzar that next morning, and he goes to great lengths before he gives the interpretation to make sure that Nebuchadnezzar knows that this is not coming from Daniel, but there's only one who knows the future, and it is Jehovah God. He goes to great lengths in that passage to make him understand that you need to be listening to the same God I'm listening to. I'm not the great man, Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not something supernatural or special. It is God that is supernatural. It's God that is special. He says you need to listen to him like I do. Now, and he tells him his entire dream, and he gives him the interpretation thereof. Now, Daniel is a man who brings us back to understanding it's not you and I that are supernatural people. It is the God that we serve. And the God that we serve knows what's going to happen in 5 minutes, and in 5 years, in 50 years, and in all of eternity. God knows exactly what's going on. Now, it only makes common sense that if you know somebody that knows the future and you need to know about tomorrow, that you would get on your knees before him and beg of him to show you what the future holds for you. I have this decision to make. Help me to do that which is right. Show me which way to go. One step at the time is the way that God shows us most of the time. But God knows. And why is it that if God knows that we so often go off on our own way? I'm not quite sure, but I've done it, and you've done it too. Now, let's look at James's illustration here, because it is an interesting illustration. He tells us that life is short. He tells us that death is certain. And he tells us that God is over all of it. But he says in this little verse that life is like a vapor that appears for a little time and then it vanishes away. So he tells us that life is short. We could go around the room and you could all tell me your ages. And you would probably tell me, I'm looking for more years to come. I think all of us want a few more years. My wife's grandmother was right at 100 when she died. I'm sure that she thought life was short. Born in 1905 and died in 2005, and she went from living in a house, a two-room house in the mountains of North Georgia, walking wherever she went, to seeing people walk on the moon. She saw so many things, saw just about the entire 1900s here in America. Never had a driver's license. Saw all kinds of things. But I guarantee you she'd have said, this has been a short walk. I hadn't been here very long. I've never met anybody that says, man, I've just lived 10 years over my limit. I don't know when I'm going to get to go home, but I'm ready for the bus to show up right now. I just hadn't met any of those folks yet. For all of us, we look at life, and life just looks a little short. And so he tells us it's like watching the steam rise off of a pot. He says it rises up, and then it just disappears. You can't look way up here and see the steam. You have to keep your eyes right here where the pot is, because that's as long as it lasts in our eyesight. That's as long as it lasts in our eyesight. We know that the steam disappears from our eyesight, but that it continues to rise all the way to the ceiling or all the way to the clouds. But in our eyesight, we just see it for a very short period of time. James was stressing to us, you act like you're going to live forever on this earth. He says, I got news for you, you're not. We only have a certain amount of time to be in the sight of the people around us, and for us to do anything with this life, it's just a short period of time. And then we're going to be into the eternity. But he impresses upon us the nature of steam. One, we just see it for a short while and it's gone away. But there's also the power of that steam that we need to think about before we dismiss this verse, because he's talking about our lives. There was a scientist sitting in front of a fireplace watching a cast iron pot with a lid on it cook. It was sitting over the fire. And it got so hot that the steam inside the pot built up, and it began to rock that cast iron lid on that pot. And you're sitting there saying, yeah, we've all seen that happen. And like millions of other people, they just said, huh. That scientist looked at that and said, there must be a great deal of strength in steam. It's able to move a heavy cast iron lid. And yet you can't grab it with your hands. You can't hold on to it. It just rises and then it's gone. It moves the lid, it sneaks out, and then it's no more. But he said, it must be powerful. As he sat back in that chair, he thought, if we could only channel steam. If I could make it run down a pipe and make it move something at the other end. If I could create an arm tied to an axle, and if I could put enough steam in that pipe to move that piston, and that piston would rotate that axle, I could turn a machine. And he invented what you know as a steam engine today. It revolutionized America because it enabled you people like you and me to turn on a machine and to saw huge logs. It enabled us to run metal through presses. It enabled us to run locomotives down the railroad track and move tons upon thousands of tons of cargo. It moved ships across the oceans. And all it is steam. You can't hold it in your hand. Now follow me. James is talking about life. Can you hold life in your hands? can you just reach out and grab it and hold it in your hand and say, you can't go anywhere? None of us can. If we could, we would. But we can't. Remember, he's talking about life, and he's using steam as the illustration. And he says life is fleeting, and we all understand how fleeting life is because every one of us have lost somebody, and we've lost them at an earlier age than what we thought we should have lost them. And so we know how fleeting life is. But James leaves us with the understanding about how powerful life can be. If it just slips out of the lid of a pot, it's just going to drift off into the clouds. But if it's channeled, it can move ocean liners across the ocean. Now James says to us, listen, life is short. But it is the most powerful thing that you have. And if your life is channeled, it can raise godly children. It can make a godly home. It can make a godly politician. It can make a godly invention. It can preach the gospel. It can turn this world upside down. Or your life can just kind of pop out from under the lid and just be wasted. James is much deeper with us. Remember, this whole book is about maturing. It's about growing. And he reminds us of the truth. I've asked you to know yourself and to know the future. The truth about yourself is that life is short. The future is there's eternity out there. But right now, you have the power to change the world, literally, with one solitary life. One solitary life. Your life is extremely important. And James is asking you, as a mature Christian, it should be channeled. It should have direction to it. It should have purpose to it. It shouldn't just wake up every morning and flit the day away and come to the nighttime and say, what have you done today? Well, I really don't know that I've done anything. You remember, he said it's short, people. It's short. You're not promised tomorrow, remember? Today is all that you have promised to you. And he says your life is capable of accomplishing the will of God right now. He's challenging them to know that the future can be molded through your life by the hand of God. James says to us, it's going to vanish away. What are you going to do with it? It's a choice you'll make today and every day of your life. You can just get up in the morning and go to work and punch the clock and come home and watch television and the 6 o'clock news and go to bed and do it all again the next day and be like the steam that escapes from the lid of the pot. Just blowing a day at the time. And nothing to show for it. Or you can channel your life on your job, in your home, or wherever. And God can use you. Just ask Him, Father, what would you have me to do with today? I've got half a day left. It's nearing 12 o'clock. What do you want me to do with the rest of my day? God has a plan for you if you'll listen. But let's move along with this. He tells us then that we need to know our God. We need to know our God. He says, verse 16, but now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. That means you're worshiping yourself. He says in verse 17, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. He said, this is what God thinks about you. It's not good enough just to be born again and still live like a lost person, which is what happens many times. We still do business like a lost person. We still talk like a lost person. We still treat other people like a lost person. Let me give you a quick example of it. Jesus gave us a magnificent example of this. He told the story about who is your neighbor. And he said that there was this guy that was going down the road. Some people stopped him, beat him up, robbed him, threw him in the ditch, and left him for dead. He said along came a priest who was coming from Jerusalem to through Jericho. He had been at the temple. He had been working with the sacrifices. He had been worshiping God. He had been chanting the Psalms. And he comes down the road and he sees the guy laying in the ditch. And he says, I just don't have time for this today. Did he know about loving his neighbors himself? Yes. Did he know about doing good? Yes. Did he know about sacrifices? Yes. I don't have time for this guy today. And he went by on the other side of the road. Along comes another church guy, a Levite. And he's been up at Jerusalem and he's been carrying on the work of God. And he's had his orders and he's been there for a month. And he's on the way home and he sees the guy and he knows about love and about kindness and all that kind of stuff. And he says, I ain't got time for this today. And so he walks on the other side of the road. And Jesus said, then comes along this half-breed, this Samaritan. He's half Gentile, half Jew, half this, half that. And he sees the guy on the side of the road, and he says, you know, the right thing to do is to help somebody in need. Well, he might be a drunk. Well, he might be, but he's still in need. Well, he might be a dope addict. Well, he might be, but he's still in need. Well, you don't know, he might have robbed somebody, killed somebody. You're right, but he's still in need. The right thing would be to gather them up and take them and get them well. And he does the right thing. Jesus says this is the one who was the neighbor. James would tell us that you and I know the 10 Commandments. We know not to covet, and we know not to have any God before us, and we know not to lie, cheat, steal, and all of that goes in between it. He says, because we know what is right, when we do not do what is right, it's sin. Well, preacher, I didn't lie, cheat, or steal. I just didn't reach out to that person in love. I mean, nobody else did either. I'm just following the crowd. James says if we're going to mature, if we're going to be grown-up Christians, then when we know what is right, we do not let the world confuse us. We go and do what is right. Well, the world may not like us. Yes, that's probably true. But we do what is right. This whole passage is about doing God's will. I have so many people tell me, preacher, if I just knew God's will, I would do it. And I want to step back and say, I think you're lying to me. Because I come to find out that most people know what God wants them to do at the very moment. They just don't want to do it. They know what's right. They know what God wants. They just really don't want to do it. And I put myself in that same category. Been there and done it. James says, if you know what's right and you don't do it, it's just as bad as lying, cheating, stealing, killing, or doing anything else. Now he's getting close to home, isn't he? He's making us say, you know, preacher, I think I'll just stay a small child, Christian-wise, because this just sounds like too much work. Well, it may be work, but the benefits are out of this world. The benefits are unbelievable. Do God's will. Do God's will. Do whatever He's telling you to do right now, and obedience will produce clarity as to what He wants you to do next. The cloud that's there that you can't see through, God will clear it out of the way when you first do what He's asked you to do right now. And He's asking you to do what is right. Let's go to the Lord in a word of prayer. My Father in heaven, we in the church struggle.